Before the town existed, before the mansion rose above the hills of Pennsylvania, there was only failure. In the late 1800s, the inside of a small candy shop in Lancaster smelled of burnt sugar and disappointment. Copper kettles hissed over open flames, while thick caramel bubbled and stuck to the sides of the pans. The air was hot, sweet, and heavy, but the cash register stayed quiet. Milton Hershey had already failed more than once. He had tried to build a candy business in Philadelphia. It collapsed. He tried again in Chicago. It collapsed again. Another attempt in New York followed the same pattern: long hours, mounting debt, and the slow realization that the customers were not coming. By the time he returned to Pennsylvania, he carried the reputation of a man who kept trying and kept losing. Inside the workshop, the work was physical and relentless. Sugar had to be boiled to the right temperature, milk spoiled easily, candy burned quickly if the fire ran too hot. Every batch was a gamble, and every mistake cost money he didn't have. But failure taught him something important. Americans loved sweets, but most candy at the time was expensive, inconsistent, and difficult to mass produce. If he could make candy reliably, in large quantities, and sell it at a price ordinary people could afford, the market would be enormous. The breakthrough came with caramel. Caramel was durable. It could be shipped long distances without melting or spoiling. Hershey refined the process, improved the machinery, and turned what had once been a small kitchen operation into a growing industrial production line. Copper kettles gave way to larger equipment. Production moved faster. Orders increased. For the first time in his career, the business did not collapse. It exploded. By the early 1990s, the Lancaster Caramel Company was shipping candy across the country and into Europe. The man who had once struggled to keep a single shop open now ran a booming factory filled with steam, sugar, and constant motion. Then, at the peak of his success, he made a decision that surprised everyone around him. He sold the entire caramel business, and instead of retiring rich, he chose to risk everything again on something far more uncertain: chocolate. Chocolate was not the obvious next step. At the end of the 19th century, chocolate was still considered a luxury in America. Most of it came from Europe, where factories in Switzerland and Germany had already mastered the machinery needed to turn bitter cacao beans into smooth, creamy bars. In the United States, chocolate remained expensive, inconsistent, and out of reach for many families. Milton Hershey became convinced that this could change. At the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, he watched European chocolate-making machines operate for the first time. Massive rollers crushed roasted cacao beans into thick paste. Steel conches churned chocolate for hours, smoothing the texture until it flowed like liquid velvet. The air around the machines carried the rich scent of cocoa and warm sugar. He didn't just admire the process, he bought the machinery. Shipping the heavy equipment back to Pennsylvania was expensive and risky. Chocolate production required new techniques, new ingredients, and new supply chains reaching across oceans to cacao farms in tropical climates. It was an enormous gamble, one that many people around him didn't understand. He had already built a successful business. Why start over in an industry dominated by European experts? But Hershey had a different vision. He wanted chocolate to become an everyday food, not a luxury reserved for the wealthy. To do that, production needed to be larger, faster, and cheaper than anything America had seen before. Instead of building his factory in a crowded industrial city, he chose open farmland in rural Pennsylvania, surrounded by dairy farms that could supply fresh milk for a new kind of product, milk chocolate for the American market. Construction began on a factory unlike any he had built before. Brick buildings rose from fields that had once grown corn and wheat. Rail lines stretched toward the site, ready to carry sugar, cocoa, and finished chocolate bars across the country. Inside, giant mixers and conching machines prepared to run day and night. The gamble was enormous. If Americans didn't embrace chocolate, the fortune he had earned from caramel could disappear as quickly as his earlier businesses had failed. But the factory was only the beginning of what he intended to build. The factory rose first. The town came next. As construction crews finished the long brick buildings and smokestacks of the chocolate plant, another kind of project began to unfold around it. Dirt roads were graded and widened. Wooden houses appeared in neat rows. Trees were planted along streets that had not existed months earlier. Milton Hershey wasn't just building a workplace, he was building a community. At the turn of the 20th century, most American factory towns were crowded, noisy, and harsh places to live. Workers rented cramped apartments near industrial districts filled with smoke and noise. Long hours inside factories were followed by evenings in neighborhoods shaped entirely by industry. Hershey wanted something different. He imagined a town where workers could live comfortably close to their jobs, where families had access to parks, schools, and clean streets. Instead of brick tenements and narrow alleys, the new town featured open spaces, tidy houses, and tree-lined roads. Electric trolley lines connected neighborhoods to the factory. Streetlights illuminated roads after sunset. Public parks and gardens gave families places to gather and relax. The air itself felt unusual for an industrial town. On many days, the breeze carried the faint smell of chocolate from the factory across the streets. The scent drifted past front porches and shop windows, becoming a daily reminder of the industry that powered the town. Stores opened, schools welcomed children. A sense of stability took root around the factory gates. Workers didn't just arrive for shifts and leave at night. They built lives in the shadow of the chocolate plant. The experiment worked. As production increased, more families moved to the area, and the town grew alongside the factory that supported it. But as the streets filled and the community expanded, another construction project began on a quiet hill overlooking it all. By 1905, the hill above the town had become a construction site of its own. Carriages climbed the winding road carrying timber, stone, and crates of carved woodwork. Workers measured foundations and raised scaffolding while the sounds of hammers echoed across the valley below. From the rising structure, the entire chocolate town could be seen. The factory smokestacks, the rows of new houses, and the trolley lines threading through the streets. This would become High Point Mansion. The estate was designed to feel elegant but restrained, built with wide porches, tall windows, and carefully landscaped gardens that stretched across the hillside. Inside, polished wood floors reflected soft light from tall windows. Staircases curved upward beneath detailed moldings. Rooms opened into one another with the quiet confidence of a home meant to last for generations. The mansion's position was intentional. From its highest windows, the factory remained visible in the distance, its smokestacks rising above the town like steady markers of purpose. It was close enough to watch, but far enough to feel peaceful. An estate that overlooked the world its owner had created. The house was meant to be filled with family life. Milton Hershey and his wife, Catherine, known as Kitty, had built their success together. After years of failure and uncertainty, the mansion represented stability. It was meant to be the place where future generations of the Hershey family would grow up, where children would run through the gardens and inherit the empire rising below the hill. But as the rooms filled with furniture and the gardens matured, the future they had imagined began to change. The mansion was ready for heirs. The heirs never arrived. The turning point arrived quietly. Inside the mansion's large windows, sunlight still poured across polished floors and carefully arranged furniture, but the atmosphere had begun to change. Catherine Hershey's health was failing. What had once been a house filled with plans for the future slowly became a place filled with difficult conversations about time. Doctors visited more often. Travel slowed. The long years ahead that the couple had once imagined together began to feel uncertain. And with that uncertainty came a question that refused to fade. What would happen to everything they had built? The chocolate factory was expanding rapidly. The town continued to grow. The fortune generated by the company had reached a scale far beyond what the couple had once dreamed possible. Yet the mansion on the hill remained quiet. There were no children to inherit the rooms, the business, or the responsibility. Milton Hershey had spent his life building stability after years of failure. Now he faced the possibility that the empire he created might outlive the family it was meant to support. The answer he chose was unlike anything most industrialists of his time would have considered. In 1909, he founded the Milton Hershey School, originally created to provide housing and education for orphaned boys. The idea began modestly, but the intention behind it was enormous. He believed that the wealth created by his company should provide opportunity for children who had none. Then he made the decision that changed the future of the company forever. Milton Hershey transferred the majority of his wealth and company shares into a trust designed to fund the school long after his lifetime. The documents that sealed the decision were quiet, formal, and precise, but their impact would echo for more than a century. The mansion that had been built for a family legacy was no longer waiting for heirs. It was now tied to a future that extended far beyond the Hershey name. The decision changed the direction of the empire, but the greatest test of it came years later. When the Great Depression spread across the United States, factories closed and unemployment surged. Entire towns built around industry fell silent as companies struggled to survive. Demand dropped. Orders disappeared, and the future of countless businesses suddenly felt uncertain. Hershey, Pennsylvania faced the same storm. Inside the chocolate factory, the machines still hummed, but the economic pressure was impossible to ignore. Across the country, families were cutting expenses, and luxury foods were often the first to disappear from shopping lists. The town that depended on chocolate now faced the same fear spreading across the nation. Milton Hershey responded in a way that surprised even his closest advisors. Instead of shutting down construction and reducing spending, he launched new building projects across the town. Workers who might have lost their jobs were hired to build hotels, theaters, and community buildings. Concrete mixers churned, steel beams rose into the sky. Construction crews worked through cold mornings and long afternoons, while much of the country struggled with unemployment. The goal was simple: keep people working. The factory continued producing chocolate, and the town continued growing, even during one of the most difficult economic periods in modern history. The trust supporting the school remained intact, and the vision he had set in motion continued moving forward despite the uncertainty surrounding it. Milton Hershey lived long enough to see his company and town survive the crisis that had devastated so many others. When he died in 1945, the systems he had created were already in place. The company, the school, and the town were designed to continue without him. The true test of his decision, however, would unfold in the decades that followed. The mansion never stopped overlooking the town. Long after the factory expanded and the company grew into a global brand, the house on the hill remained exactly where Milton Hershey had placed it, quiet, dignified, and watching over the streets he had built from empty farmland. The trolley line still ran through town, the brick buildings still stood, and the smell of chocolate still drifted through the air on cold mornings. But the most remarkable part of the story unfolded after Milton Hershey was gone. The trust he created did exactly what he intended. The majority of the company's wealth continued flowing into the Milton Hershey School, quietly funding education, housing, and opportunities for thousands of children who had no families of their own. Year after year, as chocolate bars rolled off assembly lines and shipments left Pennsylvania for the rest of the world, the profits followed the same path he had chosen decades earlier: into classrooms, into dormitories, into futures he would never see. The town he built never became a ghost of its founder. Instead, it continued operating with the same unusual purpose that made it different from other industrial cities. Streets remained tidy, parks stayed open, schools expanded, the factory modernized without leaving the community behind. The mansion itself changed roles as well. No longer a private residence, it became a preserved piece of history, a place where visitors could walk through quiet rooms and imagine the decisions that once shaped an entire town. The polished floors, the wide windows, the careful gardens all remained, but the pressure of legacy had softened into memory. Today, the Hershey name appears on store shelves across the world. Millions of people unwrap chocolate without ever thinking about the hill above the town where it all began. Yet every bar sold still connects back to that decision made over a century ago. The choice to leave an empire not to heirs, but to strangers. And the mansion still looks out over Hershey, Pennsylvania, just as it did in 1905. Long after the factory machines he once watched have been replaced and modernized, the town of Hershey still carries the shape of Milton Hershey's original vision. Streets remain lined with trees. Parks and schools still serve the community that grew around the chocolate plant. And the mansion on the hill continues to look out over the rooftops and factory buildings below. The company he built has become one of the most recognizable food brands in the world. Millions of chocolate bars leave production lines every day, traveling far beyond Pennsylvania to store shelves across continents. Yet the most unusual part of the story remains largely invisible to the people unwrapping them. A large portion of the company's success still flows into the Milton Hershey School. The classrooms, dormitories, and programs supported by the Trust continue providing education and housing for thousands of children. The decision made inside a quiet mansion more than a century ago continues shaping lives today. High Point Mansion now stands as a preserved reminder of the moment when an industrial fortune changed direction. Visitors walk through rooms that were once meant for heirs and see instead the legacy of a different kind of inheritance, one that reaches far beyond a single family name. The chocolate empire did not disappear when its founder was gone. It kept growing, but it grew in the direction he chose. And this mansion is not the only American estate built for a legacy that never followed the traditional path.